Hey guys, tonight we begin with something deeply, profoundly weird, and I mean that in the most relaxing way possible. So you're probably here because you couldn't sleep, or maybe you're just winding down after a long day, and you've decided, smartly, that the best way to drift off into the void is to listen to some guy talk about European royalty for the next couple of hours. Which, honestly, is a solid life choice, and I appreciate you for making it. Tonight, we're going to be doing something a little different. We're not just talking about kings and queens who were slightly messed up, no. We're going deep into the historical record to examine some of the most comprehensively, catastrophically inbred humans to ever sit on a throne, and I mean inbred. Like, the kind of genetic decisions that make modern biologists weep into their beakers. Now, before we get started, do me a favor. Dim those lights, put your phone on silent, or don't, I'm not your mum. Grab whatever you use to get comfy, a blanket, a pillow, maybe some hot tea if you're civilized, and just settle in. This is going to be a long, slow, deeply unexciting ride through the absolute weirdness of royal bloodlines, and honestly, that's the whole point. See, here's the thing about European monarchy. For hundreds of years, these people were obsessed, and I mean genuinely obsessed, with keeping their bloodlines pure. Which sounds nice in theory, but in practice meant they married cousins. Then they married the children of those cousin marriages to other cousins. Then those kids married their cousins, and somewhere along the way, they seem to forget that genetics is a thing that exists. The result? A truly staggering catalogue of physical deformities, mental illness, infertility, and just weirdness. Lots and lots of weirdness. We're going to float through about 200 years of this tonight, looking at some of history's most prominent examples. We'll start in Spain, because if there's one country that absolutely committed to the bit when it came to royal inbreeding, it was Spain. Then we'll drift through Austria, some bits of Britain, and finally we'll end up looking at some smaller German principalities that basically treated their throne rooms like a very uncomfortable family reunion that never actually ended. So if you're ready, let's begin. Or, alternatively, you can stop right now and go watch something actually exciting, but you're still here, which means you've already committed to 2 hours of monarchical dysfunction, which is great. Honestly, I respect that decision. Let's go. Alright, so we're starting in Spain. And specifically, we're starting with the Spanish branch of the House of Habsburg. Now, if you're not familiar with the Habsburgs, here's the basic summary. They were German mostly, but they married their way into controlling basically the entire European continent. And by married their way into, I mean they did what every other royal dynasty did, which was marry strategically for power. Except the Habsburgs decided that the best way to maintain control was to marry each other, like really aggressively. The thing about the Habsburgs is that they're famous for something called the Habsburg Jaw. It's not that they had bad oral hygiene, it's that their bottom jaws literally extended further out than their top jaws, creating this very distinctive underbite situation. And you might think this was just one guy who had this problem. You would be wrong. This was a genetic feature that became so common among the Spanish Habsburgs that it basically became the family trademark. It was like their version of a birthmark, except it affected how they could eat and speak. Fantastic, right? And here's where it gets weird. The Habsburgs knew about this. They knew that their inbreeding was causing physical problems, and their response was not, and I want to stress this, not to stop inbreeding. Their response was to commission paintings of themselves that minimized it, or sometimes just ignored it entirely. There's a painting from the 1600s of a Spanish Habsburg ruler, and if you look at the actual man versus the portrait, it's almost comical. The portrait shows a guy with a relatively normal jaw. The real guy looked like someone had grabbed his face and stretched the bottom half down about 3 inches. But I guess when you're paying the artist, you get to choose how much your genetic problems show up in your official portraiture. So let's talk about where this all started. Because the Spanish inbreeding problem didn't happen overnight. It was a slow-motion disaster that developed over decades. The Habsburgs came to Spain through marriage in the late 1400s. A guy named Philip the Handsome married a Spanish princess named Joanna, and boom, Habsburg Spain was born. Now Philip was famous for being, well, handsome. The name wasn't ironic. The guy actually had normal proportions, he was fine. But more importantly, he was hot enough that his wife Joanna became somewhat obsessed with him. We're talking genuinely unwell about it. Joanna was so obsessed with Philip that when he died in 1506, which was only about 10 years into their marriage, she basically had a complete psychological breakdown. And I'm not saying that lightly. This woman carried her dead husband's corpse around Spain for like 2 years. She refused to let them bury him. She would keep his coffin in her bedroom. She would sleep next to the box containing her dead husband's remains. Eventually, Joanna's family was like, okay, this has to stop, and they locked her up. They called it protective custody. But let's be honest, it was an insane asylum. They kept her locked in a castle for the rest of her life. She was called Joanna the Mad, and the weird part is, I'm not even sure she was actually mad, or if she just had severe depression and was dealing with that in a very public way in the 1500s, which meant everyone decided she was insane. But here's the thing, and this is important. Joanna had kids with Philip before he died, and those kids would go on to rule Spain. And here's where the inbreeding starts to really become a factor. Joanna and Philip had a son named Charles. Charles became the King of Spain and the Holy Roman Emperor, which is basically saying he ruled a significant chunk of Europe. Charles was normal enough as kids go. He looked mostly fine, but he made a choice that would echo through Spanish history for the next 200 years. He decided to marry his cousin. Her name was Isabella of Portugal, and she was, you guessed it, his first cousin. Now this wasn't unusual for the time. Cousin marriage was completely normal among European royalty. But what made Charles's choice interesting was what he did next. Because after Charles died, his son Philip II took over. And Philip II took a look at this whole marrying cousins thing and decided that it wasn't quite weird enough, so he married his aunt. Then, after his aunt died, he married his niece. I want to let that sink in for a moment. This man married his aunt, and then, after she died, married his aunt's child, his niece, his own niece. Now Philip II is a complicated figure in history. He's famous for being incredibly religious, extremely autocratic, and genuinely committed to Catholic Spain. He built the Escorial, which is this massive monastery palace in Madrid. It's huge, it's beautiful. He spent a lot of money and a lot of time commissioning art, expanding the empire, all of that. But he also spent a lot of that time dealing with the fact that his children, the products of his aunt and niece marriages, were increasingly sickly. His first marriage, to his Aunt Maria, produced 3 children. 2 of them died in childhood. The third, a son named Don Carlos, lived to adolescence but quickly revealed himself to be, well, let's call him profoundly unstable. Don Carlos had violent outbursts. He tried to kill people. He had what seems, from the historical record, to have been some form of mental illness. Philip II eventually locked him up in a tower, where Don Carlos died at age 23, under circumstances that remain somewhat unclear but certainly involved a lot of prison and a lot of sadness. Philip II's second marriage was to Mary I of England. You might know her as Bloody Mary. It was a political marriage, meant to unite Catholic Spain and Catholic England. It didn't go great. Mary was also emotionally unstable, dealt with significant depression, and the marriage didn't produce any kids. When Mary died, Philip moved on. Philip II's third marriage was to his niece, Elizabeth Valois. And this is where things start to get really weird genetically. Because Elizabeth was the daughter of the King of France, yes, but she was also the daughter of a woman named Catherine de' Medici. And Catherine was obsessed with preventing her family from marrying outsiders, which meant she'd already married Elizabeth to Philip's son Don Carlos, before Elizabeth married Philip II. So Philip II married his niece, who had previously been married to his son Don Carlos, who was now dead. If you're keeping track, that's Philip marries his aunt. Aunt dies. Philip marries his niece. Niece had been married to Philip's son. Philip's son was locked in a tower because of his genetic issues and died. Nobody had a good time. And just when you think this story couldn't get weirder, Philip II did it again. He married for the 4th time, this time to his cousin Joanna of Spain. Yes, another cousin. They had 2 children together. One was normal. The other, a daughter named Maria, was described in letters as being extremely sickly, prone to illness, and generally not doing great. By the time Philip II's reign ended, he was king for like 40 years. Spanish royal blood had been mixed with itself so many times that the genetic deck was basically stacked against anyone born into it, and nobody seemed to care. Or, more accurately, nobody could care, because stopping the inbreeding would mean marrying outside the family, which would mean that some outside family got a claim to the Spanish throne, which was apparently worse than having a succession of increasingly weird-looking and mentally unstable children. So that's where we are as we move into the 17th century in Spain. The throne is occupied by increasingly problematic individuals, and the inbreeding is, if possible, about to get worse. Okay, so we need to talk about Charles II of Spain. And I want to do this carefully, because Charles II is one of those historical figures where it's very easy to swing into making fun of someone's appearance, and he was genuinely a victim of his own family's terrible choices. So let's approach this with some dignity. Charles II was born in 1661, to Philip IV of Spain and his second wife. Now Philip IV had married his first wife, who was his cousin. When she died, he married a woman who was not his cousin, and everyone was like, oh good, maybe the genetic issues will stop. And then Philip IV looked at that and was like, no, actually, let me marry my cousin's daughter. So Charles II's mother was the daughter of Philip IV's cousin. Philip IV was Charles II's father. This means that Charles II's parents were, in modern terms, uncle and niece. Or, to put it another way, they were first cousins once removed. I know that sounds technical. The point is, they were very closely related. Now, let's talk about what Charles II looked like. There are a lot of paintings of him, so we have pretty good records. And the thing about Charles II is that the inbreeding had finally reached critical mass. His jaw, the famous Habsburg jaw, was so pronounced that he physically could not close his mouth completely. There was just a gap. His mouth wouldn't shut. He also had a very prominent forehead. His eyes were spaced in a way that made them look kind of bulbous, and his overall facial structure was, to be blunt, not what you'd call attractive. But here's the thing, all of that physical stuff was secondary to the real problem. Charles II was infertile, completely unable to produce children, which was a massive problem because in monarchy, the entire point of having a king is so that he can produce heirs. If the king can't produce heirs, then what's the point? The whole system falls apart. Charles II was aware of his infertility. It distressed him. He married a woman named Marie-Louise of Orleans, and he was very upset when they didn't have any children. Then Marie-Louise died, and he married another woman named Maria Anna of Neuburg, and again, no children. He actually tried to get an annulment because he thought maybe the problem was the marriages, not him. The church said no, so he just kind of lived with it. Now Charles II's reign lasted about 35 years. For most of that time, he spent his energy trying to have a child. He didn't. He also spent a lot of time being a pretty mediocre administrator. He was often described as being depressed, which, honestly, given his circumstances, seems reasonable. He had the weight of the entire Spanish Empire on his shoulders, he looked weird, he couldn't have kids, and everybody knew it. That's a lot to deal with. The weird part, and there's always a weird part with these royals, is that Charles II was also known for being extremely superstitious. He had exorcisms performed on him, believing that he was possessed by demons. He believed that his infertility was the result of witchcraft. He kept a collection of reliquaries, basically boxes containing bones and other body parts of saints, that he would pray to, believing they might grant him the ability to father a child. One of his doctors actually suggested that maybe the problem was that he was spending too much time in prayer, and not enough time, having sex. So Charles II actually took this advice. He hired someone to help him understand the mechanics of reproduction. I'm not entirely sure how you explain sex to a 30-year-old king, but apparently the doctor tried. It didn't work. The other weird thing about Charles II is that he was extremely dependent on his mother. His mother, Mariana of Austria, who, remember, was his first cousin once removed, essentially ruled Spain for much of his early reign. She was obsessed with maintaining power. She brought in a confessor named Father Froilan, who had enormous influence over her, and therefore enormous influence over the young king. Now Mariana was also the product of inbreeding. Her father was a Medici, her mother was a Spanish Habsburg, she had married her uncle, and she had a lot of the same genetic problems as her son, including the jaw situation and a general tendency toward what we might now call depression or anxiety. But what she did have was ambition. She wanted to control Spain. There's a period in Charles II's reign where Mariana is basically ruling the country. She's making political decisions, she's choosing advisors, and she's doing this while also trying to ensure that Charles II's court is as dependent on her as possible. It's a very dysfunctional dynamic. At one point, Charles II's advisors literally stage a coup to remove his mother from power. They succeed, and Mariana is essentially exiled to a convent. But here's where it gets weird. Even after she's exiled, Charles II misses her. He writes her letters. He asks her for advice on political matters. He's just very emotionally attached to his mother, in a way that seems, to the modern observer, somewhat unhealthy. Anyway, Charles II dies in 1700. He's infertile, so he hasn't produced any heirs. Spain's succession is now unclear. There are a few options. He could be succeeded by a member of the French royal family, or by someone from Austria. Spain basically becomes a chess piece in European politics. Charles II's will, which he wrote while on his deathbed, names his great-nephew Philip, the Duke of Anjou, as the heir. Philip is the grandson of Louis XIV of France. This is a big deal, because it basically means that the thrones of Spain and France are about to be united under one family. This will eventually lead to the War of Spanish Succession, which is a whole thing, but we're not getting into that tonight. We're just noting that Charles II's inability to have kids resulted in basically an international incident. The weird irony is that Philip V, Charles II's heir, is way more mentally stable than Charles II ever was. He doesn't have the severe physical deformities, he can actually, function as a human. It turns out that marrying people who aren't your very close relatives results in healthier children. Who would have guessed? But that's kind of the story of the Spanish Habsburgs, right? They spent 200 years inbreeding, producing increasingly weird and unstable rulers, and then the entire succession question had to be solved by bringing in someone from France. And the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs basically disappears from history. But the Habsburgs didn't stop their weird marrying practices just because the Spanish branch was done. Oh no, they moved on to Austria. Let's float over to another royal disaster. So the Habsburgs are out of Spain now, but they're not done being weird. The Austrian Habsburgs are going to take up the mantle of genetic dysfunction and run with it for the next 150 years. And honestly, it's almost impressive how committed they are to the bit. Let's start with a guy named Joseph II. Joseph II becomes the Holy Roman Emperor in 1765, which is basically the late 1700s. By this point, the Enlightenment is happening. People are starting to think differently about government, about science, about a lot of things. And yet Joseph II and his family are still just marrying their cousins like it's 1550. Now Joseph II himself is a fairly intelligent guy. He's interested in reform. He's trying to modernize Austria. He speaks multiple languages. He's not, on the surface, a total disaster, but he's also got the classic Habsburg look. He's got the jaw situation going on. He's got the odd facial structure. And, in true Habsburg fashion, he's infertile. Joseph II married a woman named Isabella of Parma. She was not a cousin. She was actually an outsider, which was nice. They were married in 1760, and everyone was hopeful that maybe Joseph II would break the family curse and have some kids. But he didn't. The marriage was childless. Various people speculated about why. Some thought it was because of Joseph II's genetic problems. Some thought it was because Isabella was unhealthy. Some thought Joseph II was just not interested in sex, which was also possible. Isabella died after only about 15 years of marriage. Joseph II was sad about it. He actually really liked Isabella, by all accounts, but he didn't remarry. For the rest of his life, he remained unmarried and childless. This was a problem, because again, the whole point of a monarch is to produce heirs. Since Joseph II didn't have any kids, his brother Leopold II became the emperor after him. Leopold II was also the product of significant inbreeding. His mother was a Medici, his father was a Lorraine Habsburg mix, and somewhere in the family tree, there were definitely cousins marrying cousins. But Leopold II actually had kids, several of them, and this is where things get interesting. Leopold II's children are a study in how genetic problems can manifest in different ways. His son Francis II becomes the next emperor, and Francis II is kind of weird. He's not as physically deformed as some earlier Habsburgs, but he's strange in other ways. He's extremely rigid. He's obsessed with protocol. He's not great at making decisions. He's basically the kind of guy who would spend 6 hours debating the proper way to bow at a state dinner while the empire burns around him. But more interesting than Francis II are Leopold II's daughters. There are a lot of them, because Leopold II actually had a normal amount of children, which was nice, but his daughters were basically treated like trading cards. They were married off to various European princes and kings in order to maintain Habsburg influence. Let me introduce you to Marie Antoinette. You might have heard of her. She was one of Leopold II's daughters. She married Louis XVI of France, and if you know anything about French history, you know that this marriage was not a success. Now, Marie Antoinette is not the focus of tonight's narrative. We're focused on inbreeding, not French royal drama, but she's worth mentioning because she represents something interesting about the Habsburgs. She was shipped off to France at like 14 years old to marry a man she'd never met. She was expected to immediately produce heirs for France, and while she didn't have the severe physical deformities of earlier Habsburgs, she was definitely the product of significant inbreeding. Marie Antoinette was described as being extremely frivolous, extremely fond of parties and luxury, and generally not great at understanding the complexity of political situations. Now, some of this might have been personality. Some of this might have been just being a teenage girl forced to marry a stranger in a foreign country. But some historians have suggested that her behavior was consistent with someone who had some cognitive issues related to inbreeding. Marie Antoinette was described as being extremely frivolous, extremely fond of parties and luxury, and generally not great at understanding the complexity of political situations. Now, some of this might have been personality. Some of this might have been just being a teenage girl forced to marry a stranger in a foreign country. But some historians have suggested that her behavior was consistent with someone who had some cognitive issues related to inbreeding. By the time we get to the late 1700s and early 1800s, The Habsburgs have been inbreeding for so long that it's basically just part of their culture. It's not even a question anymore. They marry cousins, they have weird kids. The kids either become emperors or they're married off to other European royals who are also the products of inbreeding. It's like a giant, incestuous carousel of European monarchy.
Monarchy.
But here's where it gets really interesting. Because by the 1800s, some of the Austrian Habsburgs are starting to have health issues that are more serious than just weird jaws and looks. We start seeing mental illness crop up more frequently. We start seeing infertility become a more common problem. The genetic load from centuries of cousin marriage is basically reaching a critical point. Let me tell you about a guy named Maximilian II. Maximilian II is not a Habsburg, he's a Bavarian king. But he's married to a Habsburg, which is important. He marries a woman named Marie of Saxony, and Marie is the daughter of an Austrian archduke. So Marie has Habsburg blood, heavy Habsburg blood. Now Maximilian II is described as being intelligent and competent, but he spends much of his reign dealing with depression, possibly bipolar disorder, and a general sense of malaise. His son Ludwig II is even more of a mess. Ludwig II is famous for being obsessed with building castles. Like genuinely obsessed. He spent a fortune on castles. He built Neuschwanstein, which is the castle that inspired the Disney castle. He built Linderhof. He built Herrenchiemsee. He was just building castles constantly. And Ludwig II had some serious issues. He was obsessed with the composer Richard Wagner, to the point of what could only be described as a crush. He possibly had homosexual feelings. He had extreme difficulty relating to people. He died under mysterious circumstances, officially drowning, but possibly suicide, and he was only 41 years old. Now, was Ludwig II's dysfunction a result of inbreeding? We can't say for sure. But his mother was half Habsburg, his father was a Wittelsbach with some Habsburg ancestry, and when you look at the pattern of mental illness and eccentricity in the Bavarian royal house, it does seem like the inbreeding from their Habsburg connections might have played a role. By the mid-1800s, the Austrian Habsburgs are basically at a point where they're not even hiding the inbreeding anymore. Emperor Francis Joseph I marries his cousin Elizabeth of Bavaria. Elizabeth is gorgeous by all accounts. She's young, she's beautiful, and she's basically a princess from the movies. But here's the thing, Elizabeth is also the product of significant Bavarian and Habsburg inbreeding, and their marriage, while producing several children, is not what you'd call happy. Elizabeth, who goes by Cece among friends, is extremely depressed. She's obsessed with her appearance and her weight. She basically starves herself. She's anxious constantly. She deals with what modern doctors would probably diagnose as severe depression and possibly an eating disorder. She spends most of her marriage avoiding her husband and her responsibilities, instead traveling around Europe trying to find peace. Francis Joseph, for his part, deals with his marriage by basically ignoring Elizabeth and instead having an affair with a woman named Katharina Schratt. He sets Katharina up in an apartment in Vienna, and he spends a lot of time with her. This is not exactly a secret, everyone knows about it. But it's not like anyone can do anything about it, because Francis Joseph is the emperor, and he can do whatever he wants. Their kids are a mixed bag. Some of them are fine, some of them have significant mental health issues. Their son Rudolf, who would be the heir to the throne, is deeply depressed. He's obsessed with death. He's in love with a woman who's not his wife. He's dealing with severe anxiety and paranoia. And in 1889, he dies under mysterious circumstances in what's called the Mailing Incident. Officially, he shot himself and his mistress. Unofficially, it might have been a murder-suicide, or it might have been murder, or it might have been an accident. Nobody really knows. But he's dead, and he's dead young, and he's the heir to the throne, so now the succession is messed up again. So here's the thing about inbreeding in European royalty. It wasn't just the Habsburgs, it was everywhere. It was so normalized, so accepted, that basically every royal family in Europe was doing it to some degree. The difference was just one of scale and intensity.
Let's talk about some other places where inbreeding became a problem. First, let's go to Portugal. Portugal had its own royal family, and they were just as committed to cousin marriage as everyone else. The Portuguese House of Braganza was ruling Portugal for a couple hundred years, and they married among themselves repeatedly.
By the 1700s, there were Portuguese royals who had jaw deformities, similar to the Habsburgs. There were Portuguese royals who were infertile. There was even a Portuguese king named John V, who basically locked himself in a palace and spent all of Portugal's money on building churches and commissioning art, while slowly losing his mind to depression. John V inherited a lot of money. Portugal had found massive amounts of gold in Brazil, so there was just suddenly a lot of wealth. And John V's response was to spend it in the most unhinged way possible. He built the Palace of Queluz, which is this massive Baroque palace. He spent millions on the convent of Mafra. He commissioned artwork constantly. But he also barely left his palace. He basically became a prisoner in his own home, dealing with what sounds like severe depression and paranoia. John V had a lot of kids, but they were also the product of his marriage to his half-niece. Yes, half-niece. His father had married a woman who was his cousin, and then John V married one of the resulting daughters. John V's kids had health problems. Some of them died young. Some of them had mental issues. It was just the same pattern repeating itself over and over again. Then there's Britain. Now Britain doesn't have the same level of inbreeding that the Habsburgs had, but they were still doing it at a level that would be concerning today. The British royal family is always marrying German cousins, because there are a lot of German princesses and they all have the right bloodline. Queen Victoria is a famous example. Victoria married her cousin Albert. Now Albert was a decent guy, and they actually seemed to love each other, which is nice. But Victoria was the product of significant inbreeding herself. Her father was a British prince, her mother was a German duchess. There was definitely some cousin marriage in her ancestry. And here's where it gets interesting. Victoria and Albert had kids, and those kids married other European royals who were also the products of inbreeding. Their son Edward VII married Alexandra of Denmark, who was the daughter of the King of Denmark and a Bavarian princess. Their daughter Vicky married Frederick III of Germany, and their descendants became the German royal family. So basically, Victoria and Albert, who were the product of inbreeding, produced kids who married other people who were the products of inbreeding, and their descendants became the royals of multiple European countries. By the time you get to World War I, basically the entire European royal establishment is somehow related to Victoria and Albert through various cousin marriages and strategic alliances. This is actually a funny historical footnote. During World War I, the King of Britain, George V, the German Emperor Wilhelm II, and the Russian Tsar Nicholas II are all related. They're all cousins to various degrees, and they're fighting a war where millions of people are dying. And meanwhile, they're writing letters to each other being like, "Cousin, I regret this war, but I must defeat you." It's kind of absurd. They're basically related to each other, and they're waging war. If that's not a monument to the dysfunction of inbreeding, I don't know what is. Anyway, Britain gets lucky and doesn't seem to have the same level of severe genetic problems that other countries had. They have some health issues, sure, but nothing like the Habsburgs. This might be because they married outside the family more frequently than the Habsburgs did. Or it might just be luck. Either way, the British royal family survives the inbreeding era without producing anyone as drastically affected as Charles II of Spain.
Now let's float over to some of the German principalities. Because Germany in the 1700s and 1800s wasn't unified. There were like 30 different little kingdoms and principalities, each with their own royal family, and these royal families were inbreeding like crazy. There was the House of Saxony, which ruled Saxony and Poland at various points, the House of Württemberg, the House of Bavaria,
the House of Prussia. All of them doing the same thing, marrying cousins, producing weird kids, and then being shocked when those weird kids had health problems. Let me tell you about a specific example. In Württemberg, which is a region in what's now Germany, there was a king named William I. William I married his cousin Mary of Württemberg, and Mary, she was very sickly. She had various health problems, and she was deeply depressed. Like, severely depressed. She dealt with what we might now call postpartum depression after having kids, except it was so severe that it basically never went away. Mary spent much of her life essentially locked in her room, dealing with her depression. She had kids, which she did manage, but she wasn't really present in their lives. She was basically checked out, and one of those kids, a daughter named Pauline, ended up being married off to the King of Württemberg from a different branch of the family, so William's daughter married his cousin. The inbreeding just kept spiraling. Let me tell you about William I's son too. William I had a son named Charles, and Charles inherited the throne after William. Charles I of Württemberg married a woman named Catherine of Russia, which was good because Catherine was not a relative. She was the sister of the Russian Tsar, but Catherine was basically miserable in Württemberg. She was trapped in this cold, weird court, and she was married to a man who was not great at anything. She had kids, and then she died, and everyone was sad. The weird part about Charles I is that he was described as being mentally unstable. He had mood swings. He would be fine one moment and then completely irrational the next. He made bad decisions as a ruler. He was prone to paranoia. And while we can't definitively say that this was caused by inbreeding, genetics is complicated. He was definitely the product of several generations of cousin marriage on both sides of his family. By the time you get to the 1800s and the late 1700s, basically every German principality has the same problem. They're all the products of inbreeding. They're all marrying each other. And many of them have health issues, mental health issues, or just general weirdness that seems to correlate with the inbreeding. Alright, So let's take a break from the historical narrative for a moment and talk about why inbreeding is bad. This might seem obvious, but to understand the weirdness of royal inbreeding, we need to understand the biology. Basically, every human has 2 copies of most genes. You get one from your mum and one from your dad. Now, if those 2 genes are different versions of the same gene, what scientists call heterozygous, that's usually fine. You carry both versions, and the body figures out which one to use. But sometimes, you carry a gene that has a mutation, a bad mutation. A mutation that, if you have 2 copies of it, causes a problem. This is called a recessive genetic disorder. If you only have 1 copy, you're probably fine. You're a carrier, but you don't have the disorder. But if you have 2 copies, you're sick. Now, here's where inbreeding comes in. If you marry someone who's not related to you, the chances that you both carry the same recessive mutation are low. But if you marry your cousin, the chances are much higher, because your cousin probably carries a lot of the same mutations you do. You share grandparents, you share genes. So when cousins have kids, there's a higher chance that their kid will inherit 2 copies of a bad mutation. The kids will actually have the disorder, instead of just being a carrier. The more inbreeding that happens in a family, the worse it gets. Every generation, the amount of shared genetic material increases. Eventually, you reach a point where so many recessive mutations have become homozygous, so many bad genes are present in 2 copies, that the kid is just a genetic mess. And this doesn't just cause weird-looking jaws, it causes fertility issues. Inbreeding can cause infertility, which is what happened with Charles II of Spain. The mutations that accumulated in his genes left him unable to reproduce. Mental illness. A lot of mental health disorders have a genetic component. If you're the product of heavy inbreeding, and both your parents happen to carry genes that predispose you toward depression, schizophrenia, or other disorders, you're more likely to have those issues. Physical deformities. Like the Habsburg Jaw. That's almost certainly a result of inbreeding. It's a genetic trait that got passed down and amplified by people marrying their relatives. Immune system issues. Inbreeding can weaken the immune system. People who are heavily inbred are more prone to infection and disease. So when historians look at the Spanish Habsburgs and see that they all had weird jaws and fertility problems and mental health issues, they're not being mean. They're observing the actual genetic consequences of inbreeding. The thing that's actually fascinating is that people in the 1600s and 1700s didn't understand any of this. They didn't know about genes. They didn't know that marrying your cousin would cause genetic problems. They just knew that their kids sometimes looked weird or were sick or couldn't have children. And their explanation for this was usually something like God's will or bad humors or witchcraft. It wasn't until the 1900s, when scientists started understanding genetics, that people realized what was actually happening. By then, a lot of damage had been done. Alright, so let's talk about one more dynasty where inbreeding played a major role in their problems. The Russian imperial family. The Russian Romanovs were one of the great dynasties of Europe. They ruled Russia for like 300 years. They were immensely powerful. They had a massive empire. They had all kinds of cultural influence. And they were also deeply, catastrophically inbred. The story of Russian inbreeding is different from the Spanish story because it's more recent, and it's more directly tied to one specific genetic disorder, hemophilia. Hemophilia is a blood clotting disorder. Normally when you bleed, your blood clots and stops bleeding. If you have hemophilia, your blood doesn't clot properly. You can bleed to death from a small cut. You can have internal bleeding that you can't stop. It's a serious condition. Hemophilia is a recessive genetic disorder that's carried on the X chromosome. If you're a male and you inherit the hemophilia gene, you have hemophilia. If you're a female and you inherit the hemophilia gene on one X chromosome, you're usually a carrier, but you don't have the disease. This is because females have 2 X chromosomes, so they have a backup. Now the thing is, hemophilia is not that common. It's not a genetic disorder that usually comes out of nowhere. Usually if you have it, it's because someone in your family had it. So where did hemophilia come from in the Russian royal family? It came from Queen Victoria of Britain. Victoria was a carrier of the hemophilia gene. We're not sure where she got it. Maybe it was a spontaneous mutation, or maybe it was somewhere in her ancestry. But Victoria carried the gene. Then and here's where it gets weird. Victoria's children inherited the gene. Her son Leopold actually had hemophilia. He had a pretty rough time with it, constantly dealing with bleeding issues. Eventually he died from a bleeding-related incident when he was only 30. But more important than Leopold was Victoria's daughter Alice. Alice inherited the carrier gene from her mother. Alice married into the German royal family. She had kids, and one of her sons, Frederick, inherited the hemophilia gene and actually had the disease. Frederick had a rough time with it, but he survived to adulthood and had kids of his own. Alice also had a daughter named Alexandra, and Alexandra married the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II. Alexandra was a carrier of hemophilia. She had a 50-50 chance of passing it on to each of her sons. And when she had a son, the heir to the Russian throne, the Tsarevich Alexei, he inherited the hemophilia gene. Alexei was born in 1904. He was the only son of Nicholas II and Alexandra. He was the heir to the Russian throne. He was the future of the Russian Empire, and he had hemophilia. Now, having hemophilia as a random person would be bad, but having hemophilia as the heir to the Russian throne was a disaster. Alexei spent his entire life dealing with bleeding episodes. He would have minor injuries that normal kids would recover from easily, but for Alexei, they would turn into serious bleeding situations. He would have to be confined to bed for weeks at a time. He would be in constant pain. His parents were constantly terrified that he was going to die. Alexandra, his mother, dealt with this by becoming obsessed with Alexei's health. She was overprotective. She was anxious constantly. She barely left his side. And when doctors couldn't help, because, remember, this was the early 1900s and nobody really understood hemophilia or how to treat it, she started looking for alternative solutions. This is where a guy named Grigory Rasputin enters the picture. Rasputin was a self-proclaimed holy man. He claimed to have healing powers. He was dirty, he was crude, he drank a lot, and he was probably not actually a good person. But when he was near Alexei during bleeding episodes, sometimes Alexei seemed to improve. Maybe Rasputin was actually doing something. Maybe Alexei was improving on his own. Maybe it was all coincidence. But Alexandra became convinced that Rasputin had magical healing powers. Alexandra basically gave Rasputin enormous influence over the Russian court. He had access to the Tsar. He had access to political decisions. He was giving advice on everything from military strategy to government appointments, and he had this much power because of Alexei's hemophilia. Meanwhile, Russia is dealing with World War I. The war is going badly. There's political turmoil. There's economic problems, and the Tsar is increasingly influenced by Rasputin, who is not exactly a stabilizing force. Eventually, Rasputin is murdered by Russian nobles who are sick of his influence. They poison him, then shoot him, then apparently he escapes for a bit and has to be beaten into submission. It's a whole thing. But he's dead. By this point though, the damage is done. The Russian public is disgusted by the Tsar's family. They're disgusted by Rasputin's influence. They're losing faith in the monarchy. The revolution is coming. In 1917, the Russian Revolution happens. The Bolsheviks take over. The Tsar is overthrown. The entire Romanov family is executed, including Alexei. Alexei never got to be Tsar. He died at age 13, still dealing with hemophilia, never having ruled Russia for even a day. And here's the kicker. All of this happened because Queen Victoria of Britain, 150 years earlier, happened to carry a hemophilia gene. She had kids, who married into other families, and eventually, one of Victoria's descendants inherited hemophilia. And that descendant's presence in the Russian court contributed to the instability that led to the Russian Revolution, which led to the Soviet Union, which led to decades of communism and Cold War. I mean, I'm not saying that hemophilia is the reason communism happened, that would be silly, but it's a wild chain of events set in motion by genetics and inbreeding. Alright, so we've talked about the physical and health consequences of inbreeding, but one of the more interesting aspects of royal inbreeding is the weird behavioral stuff. The strange habits, the mental health issues, the just, odd quirks that seem to correlate with genetic problems. Let me tell you about some of these, because honestly, they're pretty fascinating. First, there's what we might call obsessive behavior. A lot of the inbred royals became obsessed with specific things. Ludwig II of Bavaria was obsessed with building castles. He built so many castles that Bavaria went bankrupt. He also became obsessed with water and spent hours in baths. He was obsessed with the night. He would sleep during the day and be awake at night. He was obsessed with beauty and aesthetics. Everything in his life had to be beautiful and perfect and precise. Now, is this obsessive behavior a result of inbreeding? We can't say for sure. But inbreeding can sometimes cause neurological issues that manifest as obsessive-compulsive behaviors, and Ludwig definitely fits that profile. Then there's Francis Joseph I of Austria, who we mentioned earlier. Francis Joseph was extremely rigid. He had a very specific daily routine, and he adhered to it perfectly every single day. He woke up at a specific time. He exercised at a specific time. He had specific meetings at specific times. Everything was scheduled. Everything was precise. He was like a human algorithm.
This rigidity seemed to be a personality trait rather than a response to circumstances. Even when things were chaotic, even during wars or political crises, Francis Joseph maintained his schedule. He wouldn't deviate from it. He would literally schedule meetings with his advisors around his fixed routine, rather than adjusting his routine to handle crises. Then there's the whole issue of depression. A shocking number of inbred royals dealt with what we would now call depression.
Joanna of Spain carried her dead husband around for years. Cece of Austria starved herself and was constantly depressed. John V of Portugal basically locked himself away. Charles II of Spain was often depressed and fatigued. Mental illness isn't necessarily a result of inbreeding. Depression can happen to anyone, but there does seem to be a higher incidence of severe depression among the heavily inbred royals. This could be a genetic thing. Inbreeding can potentially increase the expression of genetic factors that contribute to depression. Or it could be an environmental thing. Being a weird-looking person who can't reproduce, living under the constant stress of ruling an empire, would depress anyone. But one of the most interesting behavioral patterns is what I'll call inappropriate sexual behavior. Now I'm not talking about consensual affairs, I'm talking about genuine weirdness. King Ludwig II of Bavaria had what was almost certainly a crush on a man named Richard Wagner. There's a lot of historical evidence that Ludwig had homosexual attractions. For most of his life, he didn't marry. When he was finally forced to marry, it was a disaster. The marriage wasn't consummated. Ludwig was clearly not attracted to his wife, and he spent the rest of his life pining after Wagner and other men. Meanwhile, his cousin Otto, who was also a Bavarian king, Bavaria had a weird succession situation, was even more sexually dysfunctional. Otto was apparently celibate. He had a phobia about women. He was extremely religious and sexually repressed, and he spent a lot of time doing very strange things in his private chambers that involved fantasies and, well, it's unclear exactly what, because the historical record is vague, but it was weird. The few people who saw him behind closed doors suggested that his sexual behavior was unusual. There's also the weird relationship that many inbred royals had with masturbation. I know that sounds strange, but bear with me. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, there was a widespread belief among doctors that masturbation was bad for you. It would cause insanity, it would weaken you, it was a sin. A lot of royals were apparently caught engaging in masturbation and were then treated by doctors who thought they needed to be cured. Now here's the thing, the people doing the punishing and trying to cure masturbation were also the people living in a society where everyone was inbred and dealing with the neurological and psychological consequences of that. So on one hand, you had a society that was really harsh about sexual behavior and really restrictive about everything sexual. On the other hand, you had a bunch of neurologically dysfunctional people who were probably expressing that dysfunction in various sexual ways. And instead of understanding it as a neurological issue, they interpreted it as moral failing. It's a feedback loop of dysfunction that's kind of tragic to watch from a historical perspective. So let's talk about another weird consequence of royal inbreeding, the weird treatments that doctors came up with to try to fix it. Remember, we're talking about a time period, the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, when doctors didn't understand genetics. They didn't understand that the problem was rooted in the genes. So they came up with all kinds of bizarre theories about what was causing the health problems, and they tried all kinds of bizarre treatments. Charles II of Spain had doctors who believed that his infertility was caused by a blockage in his reproductive system. Their solution was to give him medications to try to clear the blockage. These medications sometimes contained mercury, which is a poison. Charles II took mercury-based treatments repeatedly. It probably didn't help his infertility, and it probably did make him sick. Other doctors believed that his infertility was caused by an imbalance of his humors. There was a whole medical theory called humoral theory that said your body had 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and if they were out of balance you got sick. The treatment was to try to rebalance them. This might involve bloodletting, it might involve purging, it might involve giving you bizarre herbal medicines. Charles II's doctors actually recommended that he try to have sex more frequently, believing that this might somehow fix the blockage. They hired someone to explain to him how to have sex. As I mentioned earlier, this didn't work. For Ludwig II of Bavaria, the medical treatments were different but equally weird. Ludwig was dealing with what was probably mental illness, possibly schizophrenia or severe depression. The treatments of the time were not great. Doctors didn't really have any effective medications, so they came up with other ideas. One theory was that Ludwig needed to be forced into activity. If you could get him engaged with the world, maybe he would get better. So people would try to force Ludwig to do things. They would try to drag him out to social events. They would try to force him to rule. And Ludwig would just resist. He wanted to be left alone. He wanted to build his castles. He wanted to be in darkness. And people kept trying to force him into the light, thinking it would help. Another theory was that Ludwig needed to be isolated. If you removed him from stressful situations, maybe his mind would heal. So he was locked away in his palaces, prevented from engaging with the world. which probably made things worse, not better. For the Russian Tsarevich Alexei, with his hemophilia, the treatments were particularly brutal. Doctors didn't understand hemophilia. They knew he was bleeding, but they didn't know how to stop it, so they tried everything. They used leeches, they gave him various herbal medicines, they performed bloodletting on him, which is just about the worst thing you could do to someone with hemophilia. They basically weakened him with treatments that were supposed to help. The one thing that seemed to help was rest. When Alexei would have a bleeding episode, doctors would basically say, "Don't move, stay in bed, try not to do anything that might cause more bleeding." And this would help, not because of any active treatment, but because rest and immobilization actually do reduce bleeding in hemophilia. Basically, the best treatment was the most boring treatment. But doctors weren't satisfied with rest. They wanted to actively do something. So they kept trying various interventions, most of which made things worse. There's also the weird phenomenon of rest cures that became popular in the 1800s. The idea was that if you were sick, particularly if you were a rich woman with vague health problems, the cure was to go to a spa or a special clinic and spend a lot of time resting. You would be confined to bed. You would be fed special foods. You would be given hydropathic treatments, basically baths in water that was supposedly medicinal. These rest cures were sometimes helpful if what you actually needed was rest and a break from stress. But they were often harmful if you actually had a real medical problem. And for a lot of the inbred royals who went to these spas and clinics, the problem wasn't something that rest could fix. They had genetic problems. They needed actual medical treatment, which didn't exist yet. Cece of Austria spent years at spas and health clinics trying to cure her depression and her physical ailments through rest cures and mineral baths. None of it really worked. She was still depressed. She still felt sick. The whole thing was probably a placebo at best and a waste of time at worst. The weird part is that some of these treatments probably did have some benefit, just not for the reasons doctors thought. A rest cure at a nice spa might actually help your mental health if you're dealing with depression, just because you're taking a break from your stressful life. Hydropathic baths might help your general sense of well-being, but the idea that this was a cure for genetic problems was ridiculous. So here's the interesting thing. By the late 1800s, people were starting to realize that inbreeding might be a problem. It wasn't because they understood genetics. It was because they were noticing patterns. They were noticing that families that had been marrying cousins for centuries were producing weird kids. They were noticing that certain royal families had a lot of health problems. They were starting to wonder if maybe this cousin marriage thing was not, in fact, a great idea. He was suggesting that maybe, just maybe, marrying your cousin might not be good for your kids. But the more data came in, the more it became clear that cousin marriage was associated with health problems. By the early 1900s, the whole eugenics movement was happening, which was a dark and weird time that I don't want to spend a lot of time on tonight because it gets into territory that's not really sleep-inducing, it's just kind of depressing. But one of the things that came out of eugenics was a serious discussion about the dangers of inbreeding. Royalty started to change their behavior. They started marrying outside the family more frequently. They started seeking out marriages with people who weren't cousins. By the 1900s, the level of inbreeding in European royal families had decreased significantly. This had some funny consequences. For example, the British royal family started marrying non-nobility. Prince Charming's wife, Camilla Parker Bowles, was not a princess, she was a commoner. This would have been unthinkable 200 years earlier. But by the late 1900s, it was fine. Actually, it was probably good, because she wasn't his seventh cousin. The Spanish royal family, after the Habsburgs were done, was basically replaced by the Bourbon family from France. The Bourbons were different. They were less committed to cousin marriage. They had healthier kids. They didn't have the jaw thing. It was a complete change. One of the interesting outcomes of the end of royal inbreeding was that royalty basically became less weird. The royals of the 20th century were less likely to be obsessive, or depressed, or physically deformed, or infertile. They were more normal humans, just with fancy titles. Which, from an entertainment perspective, was probably bad. History got a lot less interesting once royalty stopped being genetically bizarre, but from a human perspective, it was good. Less suffering, less weird jaw deformities, fewer infertile heirs, fewer obsessive castle builders. It was an overall improvement in the quality of life for royal families. The thing is, we actually know when the shift happened. It wasn't sudden, it was gradual. But if you look at the royal families of Europe in the 1600s and 1700s, they're heavily inbred. By the early 1800s, the inbreeding is decreasing. By the 1900s, they're barely doing it at all. So basically royalty figured out that inbreeding was bad about 100 years before the science could actually explain why. They just noticed the pattern and decided to stop. Which is kind of impressive actually, when you think about it. Despite having no scientific understanding of genetics, they noticed that something was wrong, and they changed behavior. So before we wrap up for the night, I want to think about the bigger picture. How did royal inbreeding actually affect the course of history? Did it matter? The answer is, kind of, maybe, in ways that are hard to measure. Let's think about Charles II of Spain. Charles II was a mediocre ruler at best. He couldn't have kids, which meant that the entire succession of Spain was thrown into doubt. The War of Spanish Succession happened partly because people were confused about who should actually rule Spain. The war lasted 13 years, hundreds of thousands of people died, and it happened partly because Charles II was the result of centuries of inbreeding and couldn't have kids. Let's think about the Russian imperial family. The presence of haemophilia in the court, and the resulting power of Rasputin, probably contributed to the instability that led to the Russian Revolution. Now, was the Russian Revolution caused by haemophilia? No, there were tons of other factors, but did haemophilia amplify certain existing problems? Possibly. Let's think about Ludwig II of Bavaria. Ludwig was a terrible administrator. He spent all the money on castles, he made bad political decisions, he was kind of a disaster as a ruler, but he was still the king of Bavaria for many years. How many political problems did his eccentricity create? How many opportunities did his strangeness cause Bavaria to miss? We'll never know, but it probably wasn't good. Let's think about Joseph II of Austria. Joseph II was actually a pretty decent reformer. He was trying to modernize Austria. But he was also dealing with depression and infertility and all the stuff that comes with being the product of heavy inbreeding. His inability to have kids meant that the succession question was always complicated. He wasn't able to focus entirely on his reforms because he was distracted by the fact that he was childless. So did royal inbreeding shape history? In small ways, maybe. In the grand scheme of things, probably not. But in lots of small ways, I think it did contribute to various historical outcomes. The more interesting question is, what would have happened if royalty hadn't been inbred? If the Habsburgs had just married outside the family from the beginning? If the Spanish throne had been ruled by healthy, fertile, mentally stable kings? If the Russian court hadn't been influenced by Rasputin because Alexei didn't have haemophilia? We'll never know. But it's interesting to imagine an alternate history where European royalty just married normally and maybe made better decisions and maybe things worked out differently. Alright, I want to end this section by just throwing some weird facts at you that didn't quite fit into the main narrative but are too strange not to mention. First, there's the fact that a lot of the inbred royals were actually pretty smart. Charles II of Spain was kind of dumb, sure, but a lot of them weren't. Joseph II was intelligent. Ludwig II was intelligent, just not in a way that was useful for ruling. The inbreeding didn't destroy their brains necessarily, it just made them weird. Second, there's the phenomenon of Habsburg lips. The Habsburg jaw was famous, but there was also a specific kind of lip shape that Habsburgs had. It's not entirely clear what caused it, but it was distinctive enough that people would recognize it. You could look at a portrait and be like, oh, that's definitely a Habsburg, look at those lips. Third, there's the fact that a lot of the inbred royals were obsessed with beauty and aesthetics. Ludwig II was obsessed with beautiful things. He surrounded himself with art and beauty. Many of the Habsburgs were patrons of art. Sissi was obsessed with beauty and looks. It's possible that living in a society that judged your appearance constantly, and being aware that you didn't meet those standards because of your inbreeding, created this weird obsession with surrounding yourself with beauty as a way of compensating. Fourth, there's the weird fact that a lot of the female royals who were products of inbreeding dealt with significant reproductive issues beyond just infertility. There were miscarriages, there were stillbirths, there were children born with problems. It was a nightmare scenario for women who were supposed to produce heirs. Fifth, there's the fact that inbreeding seemed to make people more susceptible to superstition. Charles II believed in witchcraft and demonic possession. Ludwig II believed in all kinds of mystical things. This might be because inbreeding was causing some neurological problems that made people more prone to magical thinking, or it might just be that people dealing with unexplained health problems were more likely to turn to superstition because medicine wasn't helping. Sixth, there's the fact that a lot of the inbred royals had issues with their teeth. Not just the jaw thing, but actual dental problems, bad teeth, tooth decay. It's possible that the inbreeding was affecting tooth development. Seventh, and this is my favorite weird fact, there's the phenomenon of royal physicians who were absolutely convinced that they could cure genetic problems through the right combination of treatments, even though those treatments were completely ineffective. They would try for decades to fix Charles II's infertility, trying different medications and procedures, none of which could possibly have worked because the problem was genetic. But they kept trying anyway. Alright, so we're getting toward the end of this extremely long journey through European royal inbreeding, and I think it's worth taking a moment to think about what the long-term consequences were. First, and most obviously, there was a lot of human suffering. A lot of people, not just the royals, but also their families, their advisors, their subjects, dealt with the consequences of having genetically messed up rulers. Charles II of Spain was an unhappy person dealing with infertility and strange looks. Cece of Austria was deeply depressed and dealing with eating disorders. Alexei of Russia was constantly in pain from hemophilia. These weren't just historical figures, they were real people suffering. Second, there was political instability. When your rulers are weird, or depressed, or infertile, or mentally ill, they don't make great decisions. They might make decisions that are good for them personally, but bad for the country. Or they might be so distracted by their own problems that they don't focus on governance. Or they might be so constrained by their advisors, or their mothers, or their confessors, that they can't make independent decisions at all. Third, there was a loss of cultural output. Some of these people might have done interesting things if they hadn't been dealing with the consequences of inbreeding. Ludwig II could have been a decent ruler instead of an obsessive castle builder. Joseph II could have pursued his reforms more effectively. Who knows what they might have accomplished if they'd been healthier. Fourth, and maybe most interestingly, there was a slow cultural shift in how people thought about marriage and succession. By the late 1800s, people were realizing that maybe, just maybe, the whole marry your cousin to keep the bloodline pure thing wasn't actually great. This was a slow shift, and it didn't happen everywhere at once, but it did happen. And it represented a real change in how people thought about power and inheritance. The weird thing is, this shift happened without anyone actually understanding genetics. People didn't need to understand that inbreeding produces homozygous recessive mutations. They just needed to notice that families that inbred a lot had health problems. And eventually they noticed. So in a weird way, royal inbreeding created its own solution. People got tired of dealing with weird-jawed, infertile, depressed rulers, so they stopped marrying their cousins. Problem solved, not through scientific understanding, but through observation and practical experience. By the early 1900s, European royalty had basically stopped inbreeding, and coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, European royalty became less weird, less interesting for historians maybe, but less suffering for the actual people involved. Alright, so we've been talking for a very long time about European royal inbreeding, and I'm sure at some point you've probably wondered, does any of this matter? Are we just talking about weird royal people doing weird things hundreds of years ago? And I think the answer is, kind of yes, kind of no. On one level, this is just history. It's the story of how royal families operated, what they prioritized, and how their own genetics became a problem they couldn't escape. It's interesting because it's weird and tragic and kind of darkly funny. But it's also kind of removed from our modern lives. We don't have the same pressure to marry our cousins. We have better medicine. We understand genetics. But on another level, royal inbreeding tells us something about human nature. It tells us that people will do irrational things if they believe those things will give them power or status. It tells us that people will ignore obvious evidence of problems if acknowledging those problems would require them to change their behavior. It tells us that people can convince themselves that things are normal when they're actually very weird. For centuries, European royalty didn't just engage in cousin marriage. They built entire philosophical systems to justify it. They said it kept the bloodline pure. They said it was necessary for maintaining power. They said it was perfectly fine. And meanwhile, they were producing increasingly weird, sickly kids who couldn't have children of their own. It took centuries for people to realize that maybe this system wasn't working. And even when they realized it, it wasn't because they understood the genetics. It was just because the problems became undeniable. So there's something kind of timeless about royal inbreeding. It's not just a historical curiosity. It's a story about how people rationalize bad decisions, and how it takes a long time for evidence to overcome established tradition. Also, it's a pretty weird story. which is why you're here listening to me talk about it at whatever hour of the night this is. Before we actually wrap up, I want to tell you some of the weirdest anecdotes from the world of royal inbreeding. The stuff that didn't quite fit into the main narrative but is too strange not to mention. First, there's the story of Cece of Austria's obsession with beauty. Cece was married to Francis Joseph I, and she was gorgeous, like actually beautiful. Not in the weird way that some royals painted themselves. She was genuinely, by any standard, a very attractive woman. But as she got older, she became obsessed with maintaining that beauty. She had strict exercise routines. She starved herself. She had her teeth examined constantly. She covered her face with beauty treatments. She refused to be photographed or painted if she thought she looked bad. Now, there were probably some genuine beauty standards she was trying to meet, sure, but there was also something kind of desperate about it. She was terrified of aging, terrified of losing her looks, and she dealt with that terror by basically controlling everything she could control about her appearance. The weird thing is, Francis Joseph was not helping with this. He was having an affair. He barely spent time with her. He wasn't reassuring her, or loving her, or doing any of the things a spouse might do to help their partner feel better about aging. He was just off doing his own thing. So Cece spent her entire life trying to look perfect for a man who wasn't even paying attention to her. And when he finally died, she was like 60 years old, and she'd spent her entire marriage obsessing over her appearance for someone who couldn't be bothered to notice. Then she was assassinated by an anarchist on a street in Switzerland, which is probably not the most dignified way to go. Second, there's the story of Ludwig II and the ice cave. Ludwig had an obsession with the cold. He loved ice and cold water. He would spend hours in ice water baths. He became obsessed with creating an artificial ice cave in his palace. So he had a whole underground ice cave built, complete with artificial stalactites and stalagmites made of ice. He would go into this ice cave and sit in the dark, in the cold, for hours. People thought he was weird for doing this. His advisors tried to get him to stop. They were worried that all this time in the cold would make him sick. But Ludwig didn't care. He was obsessed. Third, there's the story of Charles II of Spain and the witch hunt. Charles II was convinced that he was the victim of witchcraft. Specifically, he thought someone had cast a spell on him to make him infertile. So he actually launched an investigation to find the witch. This is in the late 1600s, mind you, when witch hunts were kind of on their way out. But apparently Charles II didn't get the memo. Inquisitors were sent out to try to find the witch. They interviewed people. They looked for evidence. They eventually decided that the witchcraft was probably coming from somewhere outside of Spain, probably France, and that the spell was probably cast by people connected to Charles II's rivals. But they never actually found a witch because there was no witch. Charles II was just infertile because of genetics, and he couldn't accept that. So he had to come up with an explanation that involved witchcraft, which is, in a way, kind of sad. This guy's brain was trying so hard to make sense of what was happening to him that it invented an entire witch conspiracy rather than just accepting genetic infertility. Fourth, there's the story of Philip II of Spain and his son Don Carlos. Don Carlos was definitely disturbed. He had violent rages. He tried to kill people. He had to be locked in a tower. And there are all these stories about how weird he was. Like there's a story about how he took a bunch of cold water baths because he thought they would make him normal. And the baths apparently made him sick, and he nearly died. But he did it anyway because he was convinced that the baths would cure him of whatever was wrong with him. Fifth, there's the story of John V of Portugal and the bells. John V was obsessed with bells. He loved the sound of bells. So he would commission bells to be made for all his churches. He would have bells rung constantly. He would spend hours just listening to bells. This might sound kind of nice and chill, actually, but it was kind of manic in nature. He was obsessed. He couldn't think about anything else. His whole life was kind of taken over by bells. And meanwhile, Portugal's economy was falling apart because he was spending all the money on bells and churches instead of maintaining the government. So he's sitting in his palace, listening to bells ring constantly while his country collapses around him. And everyone's like, "John, maybe stop with the bells, maybe focus on governance." And John's like, "No, I need more bells." It's kind of depressing, actually. Here's this guy who had essentially unlimited power and unlimited resources, and instead of using it to make his country better, he's just buying bells. Alright, so one of the interesting questions is, what happened genetically after the royal families stopped inbreeding? The answer is, things got better pretty quickly. Once the Habsburgs stopped being so obsessed with marrying cousins, their genetic problems decreased. The weird jaw thing became less pronounced, fertility improved, mental health issues became less common. The British royal family, which had been doing cousin marriage for centuries, started marrying women who weren't cousins, and guess what? Their kids were healthier. The Russian royal family's problems essentially ended once Nicholas II was overthrown and they didn't have inbreeding anymore. I mean, they had other problems, they were executed, but at least they didn't have to deal with genetic dysfunction anymore.
Nico and Duff, amazing how quickly things can improve once you change the behavior.
It's not like there's a magical cure that you have to wait generations for. It's just that if you stop doing the bad thing stops happening. Of course, there are exceptions. Some genetic problems persist. Some people carry recessive mutations that have nothing to do with inbreeding and that continue to crop up. But the massive, civilization-destabilizing genetic problems, those went away once people stopped marrying their cousins. This is actually a pretty cool example of how behavior can affect genetics, not in the sense of changing the actual genetic code, but in the sense of changing how likely certain genes are to be expressed. One of the interesting things is that by the 20th century, the royals had basically figured out something that scientists wouldn't fully understand until later, that genetic diversity is good, not consciously necessarily. They just noticed that marrying people outside the family produced healthier kids, so they did that more. And their kids were healthier, and everyone was happier. Before we actually wrap up, I want to talk about what people believed about inbreeding while it was happening. Because the fascinating thing about royal inbreeding is that people didn't think it was weird while it was happening. For hundreds of years, cousin marriage was completely normal among nobility. It was standard practice. It was what everyone did. The idea that it might cause problems was not something that occurred to most people. There were a few reasons for this. First, people didn't understand genetics. So when they saw weird results, weird-looking kids, infertile kids, sickly kids, they didn't blame the inbreeding. They blamed other things, bad humors, witchcraft, demonic possession, God's will. Second, people were obsessed with blood purity. The idea was that if you married outside the family, you were diluting your bloodline with inferior blood. This was especially true for people of color, or people from other regions, or people of lower classes. The idea was that noble blood was better than common blood, and you wanted to keep it pure. Marrying your cousin made sense because your cousin also had noble blood. Marrying a commoner made no sense because the commoner's blood would pollute your noble blood. Of course, this is all complete nonsense genetically. Marrying your cousin doesn't keep your blood pure in any meaningful way. It just concentrates whatever genetic mutations your family has. But people believed it, so they did it. Third, there were practical reasons for cousin marriage. If you married your cousin, you kept the power within the family. If you married an outsider, the outsider's family might gain power. You might have to share resources with in-laws who weren't as closely aligned with your interests. By marrying within the family, you kept things simple. Fourth, there was the whole thing about maintaining dynasties. If you married your cousin, your kids were pure members of your dynasty. They weren't half something else. They were full members of your family. Which meant that if they ended up inheriting the throne, there was no question about their legitimacy or their claim to power. So for hundreds of years, people had reasons, bad reasons, but reasons to practice cousin marriage. And the genetic consequences of that practice were basically invisible to them. They just saw weird results and made up explanations that fit with their existing worldview. Alright, I want to end this with some truly bizarre details that I haven't quite fit in elsewhere. These are the weird historical footnotes that are too strange to ignore. First, there's the fact that some of the most inbred royals were incredibly vain about their portraits. They would commission painters to paint them, and if the painter made them look too weird, they would fire the painter. So painters would basically lie. They would paint the royals looking normal, even if they looked very weird in real life. This means that if you only look at portraits, you get a totally false impression of what these people looked like. Charles II of Spain looks almost normal in his portraits. But in real life, he had a jaw so pronounced that he couldn't close his mouth. And yet he approved of the portraits that didn't show that. It's this weird thing where reality and representation didn't match. The official historical record says Charles II looked one way, but the actual reality was very different. Second, there's the fact that a lot of the inbred royals were obsessed with hunting, like seriously obsessed. They would spend entire days hunting. They would neglect governance to go hunting. It's possible that this was a way of dealing with their neurological issues, a way to express aggression or obsession in a way that was socially acceptable for a king. Or maybe they just liked hunting. But the intensity of the obsession suggests that there might have been something else going on. Third, there's the fact that a lot of the royal women who were products of inbreeding dealt with specific reproductive issues. There were problems with getting pregnant, problems with carrying pregnancies to term, problems with producing healthy children. It's possible that the inbreeding was affecting their fertility in ways that were even more severe than it was affecting male fertility. Fourth, there's the fact that a lot of the inbred royals were weirdly intellectual. They were interested in science, in art, in philosophy. They wanted to understand how the world worked. They wanted to create beautiful things. It's possible that dealing with the neurological issues caused by inbreeding made them more likely to turn inward and focus on intellectual pursuits. Or maybe I'm just pattern matching and there's no actual connection. But there does seem to be a correlation between heavy inbreeding and intellectual interest among European royalty. Fifth, there's the fact that a lot of the inbred royals became increasingly religious as they got older. Charles II was extremely religious. John V was obsessed with building churches. Many of them had confessors who had enormous influence over them. It's possible that dealing with unexplained health problems made them turn to religion as an explanation and a source of comfort. Sixth, there's the fact that a lot of the inbred royals were treated really badly by their family members. Their mothers would be cold and distant, their fathers would ignore them, their siblings would betray them. It's possible that this wasn't just coincidence. It's possible that the family dysfunction was related to the inbreeding. When everyone in a family is the product of genetic problems, maybe the family dynamics just get messed up. Seventh, there's the fact that the end of royal inbreeding basically coincides with the rise of democracy and the weakening of absolute monarchy. This is not a coincidence. As people started getting better rulers, healthier, more stable, less weird, there was less justification for absolute monarchy, which created space for political change, which eventually led to democracy in a lot of places. So in a weird way, you could argue that the end of royal inbreeding contributed to the rise of democracy. Once royals stopped being quite so genetically messed up, people realized that maybe they didn't need royals at all, at least not absolute royals who had unlimited power. Alright, so we've been talking for a very long time about European royal inbreeding. We've covered Spain, Austria, Russia, Britain, Germany, Portugal. We've talked about genetics, about medical treatments, about weird behavior, about cultural beliefs. And at this point, I think we can all agree on a few things. First, inbreeding causes genetic problems. This should not be surprising, but apparently it was surprising to European royalty for about 300 years. Second, humans are really good at coming up with explanations for things that don't make sense. Instead of accepting that their family was genetically messed up, royalty blamed witchcraft, or demons, or bad humors, or God's will. Third, when you have unlimited power and unlimited resources, you can still mess things up. Ludwig II had enormous power and resources. He used them to build castles. John V had enormous power and resources. He used them to buy bells. Charles II had enormous power and resources. He used them to try to find witches. Fourth, genetic problems are not the same as moral failing. A lot of the people we've talked about were not bad people. They were just the products of genetic decisions that were made centuries before they were born, and they had to deal with the consequences. Fifth, humans are capable of change, but change is slow. It took centuries for people to realize that cousin marriage was a bad idea, but eventually they figured it out, and they changed their behavior. Not because of scientific understanding, but just because they noticed that things weren't working the way they expected. So what's the lesson here? I'm not sure there is one really. This is just history. It's the story of how royal families operated, what they prioritized, and how their own genetics became a problem they couldn't escape. But if I had to extract a lesson, I think it would be something like, pay attention to the consequences of your behavior, even if you don't understand the mechanism behind those consequences. If you're doing something and it's producing bad results, maybe stop doing it. You don't need to understand genetics to figure out that cousin marriage is probably not great. And also, weird royal people make for good stories, but they also had to live with the consequences of that weirdness. So while it's fun to talk about Charles II's giant jaw, and Ludwig II's castles, and Cece's eating disorder, it's worth remembering that these were actual people suffering. Alright, I think at this point we've covered pretty much everything there is to cover about European royal inbreeding. We've gone from Spain to Austria to Russia to Britain to Germany to Portugal and back again. We've talked about jaws and haemophilia and witchcraft and bells and castles and ice caves. And I don't know about you, but I think it's probably time to go to sleep now. So if you're still here, listening to this, I want to say thank you. Thank you for spending this much time with me, talking about weird royals and their weird genes. Thank you for committing to 2 hours of extremely unexciting historical narrative. And thank you for being the kind of person who thinks that the best way to fall asleep is to listen to someone talk about genetic dysfunction in medieval kingdoms. That's a vibe. I respect it. So I'm going to leave you here, with a sense of calm, and a head full of information about European royal inbreeding. Feel free to fall asleep now. Your brain has had enough input. There are no more facts to learn, no more weird royals to meet, just darkness and sleep ahead. Good night. and thanks for watching.